Senator Mitchell, you had a question?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Sorry.
If I could follow up on the chair's question with regard to small businesses, we're also hearing from nonprofit organizations. That's the sector that I came from prior to be elected. And so as you look at the state budget impact, specifically Department of Developmental Services, as we're transitioning folks from the developmental centers into community-based settings, what we're hearing from folks who are running nonprofit community-based programs for that population, there's a real concern about how the increase will impact them as nonprofit organizations. So did you look at nonprofits?
The Los Angeles City Council, who commissioned our report, asked us to look at nonprofits in great detail, and I'm going to let Ken answer because he wrote that part.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that really stands out when you look at developmental disability services and childcare, those are areas where we have historically very low historically those wages have been low, and it's well documented the impact of low wages in those health and human service industries on worker turnover and then on outcomes for the consumers, be they in terms of the children in the child care centers or people in the people with developmental disabilities who are accessing those services. And so raising the wages is an important aspect of improving and addressing those service issues, but that can't be done without also increasing funding into those programs. And so I think one of the points that Michael made is through doing this, you have some savings on the Medicaid side, but the important thing is going to be moving that back into raising the reimbursement rates for child care. IHSS would go up, and developmental disability services. So in fact, people can pay those higher rates. The big disadvantage, if you don't do that, both there's not a way for them to meet the needs, but also there's been some discussion of, do you in some of the local places people talk about either carving out or phasing in over a longer period of time. And phasing in can, if the money isn't there immediately, can work, but you don't want to carve out because then you get in a situation where you make money by stopping doing those services. The workers can make more money going and working at a McDonald's than they can providing these services, and that's going to make turnover worse, and that's going to have a bigger impact on quality of care and service. So it's important that there's a strategy for bringing people up in those health and human service sectors at the same time as you're raising the wage.
And so I'm glad to hear that you had the conversation with the administration and there was a recognition that there was $1 billion available, because as we've had the conversation in this current budget cycle, around implementing the current increase in minimum wage, it is not reflected in the current budget, and that clearly is going to be a problem. One more quick question, as we talked about restaurants, and you talked about some of the geographical areas of Los Angeles. I represent both Culver City, the new hot emerging hip restaurant location in the state, and
there, yeah.
yes, as have I regularly, and West LA and South LA. That's the Senate district I represent. And so in meeting with restaurateurs who are largely small businesses in the district, as well as some of the large corporate chains, we've really talked about how the model is changing from the full service model to what they're calling the fast casual model. And so my question is, does this bill look at total compensation, or how do you deal with the issue of tips? How do we deal with the issue of servers who earn tips, which increases their,
and then you can follow up.
which increases, quite frankly, their average hourly earnings? How are we going to manage that?
So I'm going to take a stab at it,
Okay.
and then the professor will have some more astute comments for you. The bill does not address total compensation, and there's nothing in it that approaches tip credit. And for many reasons, which I'll spare you right now, we don't think that's a wise thing to do. One thing I've been having in conversation with both the California Restaurant Association and more specifically the Golden Gate Restaurant Association in San Francisco is clarifying in state law whether tips can be shared throughout the whole house. And there's some ambiguity in state law. And so we traditionally hear from the restaurant voice when we propose increases in minimum wage that it's only going to hurt those who need it the most, because they're going to have to pay the front of the house more when they're benefiting from the tips, and the back of the house won't get as much of an increase because they won't have as much given the expense on the front side, and they don't get a benefit from the tip. So that's a whole nother conversation. It's not in the bill, but I am certainly open to it, and I would like to bring together restaurant owners and labor to talk about how we could clarify tip sharing. And just real briefly, how could you honestly argue that the front of the house should get it and not the back of the house? Because there's not a plate to put on a table if it weren't for the dishwashers in the back and the chefs in the back. And so maybe it makes greater sense that the tips are shared and that would address that subject.
And so I'm clear that that would work in the traditional full-service model that we all understand. What about as we transition to this fast casual model where there are fewer, quite frankly, front-of-the-house servers who are earning tips? So would the shared model still work? How do you envision that?
The fast casual, that's sort of Panera, I guess, and maybe Chipotle, I'm not sure, but they're replacing more the limited service, the fast food segment, than they are the full service segment. So, so you might, and the fast food doesn't get tips at all. So I'm not sure we reduce that your premise is right. But it's just it's an emerging category. It illustrates very well this idea that there are different business models out there and that you can pay higher wages. I've had discussion with Panera human resources people on this, and that they maybe have a business model that would work better and has been more successful, certainly, than lately McDonald's or Burger King, and you see that in their market share. On the question of tips and tip sharing, I think what Senator Leno has described would be excellent to have that clarification. The minimum wage in Oakland, near us in Berkeley, just went up on March 2nd from $9 to $12.25 in one shot. And a lot of the restaurants, at least the upper-end restaurants, have responded by instituting an 18% or 20% service charge. And we're dropping, I think it's dropping tips, but that's not totally, you know, I've actually sent out some students to go and ask these restaurants if it really is instead of tips, they're going to add to tips. And by calling it a service charge, though, I think the ownership of that income is ambiguous. Does it actually belong to the workers and therefore can be shared equally, or is it at the pleasure of the employer to distribute that amount? And I think clarification of that, legal clarification, would be excellent.
I think that's going to be critical, because in Los Angeles, where we've begun to see that on your bill, I've asked servers and I've asked restaurant owners who are attributing that additional service fee to increase health benefits.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say, that the restaurant will say, we are adding an 18% service charge because of the structural changes caused by Proposition FF, which was the Oakland proposition. That's a verbatim quote from one of my favorite restaurants in Oakland. So.
Mr. Chair, if we've got just a second to address Senator Mitchell's concern with regard to nonprofits.
Go ahead, and we'll have Mr. Stone. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go after.
Jennifer Fearing from Cal Nonprofits is here, and that's an alliance of nearly 10,000 nonprofit organizations. She's right here, and I'm sure she could address your concerns from on the ground, if you'd like to step up. You got a mic for her? Good.
I can probably project also.
Yeah.
If that works.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Leno. Senator Mitchell, yes, I'm Jennifer Fearing on behalf of Cal Nonprofits, who we went to great pains actually last year to do outreach to our members, 10,000 members, to ask their thoughts on a minimum wage, because nonprofits have kind of multiple interests when it comes to the minimum wage. We are employers of over 1 million Californians. We're service providers, as you mentioned, and we're advocates for California's working poor. So we're trying to balance those, and by and large, a huge majority of our members support raising the minimum wage, because we're taking the long view. It's most important for our services to become less needed, quite frankly, by bringing people up and out of poverty. The issues that you've raised were similar to those for those that agreed with supporting minimum wage, but were troubled by certain implementation concerns. They related to government contracting and making sure that reimbursements would work. And we feel strongly that no exemptions should be made to the nonprofit sector. We don't want to be the low-wage sector, and as you said so eloquently, lose our employees to McDonald's and others. So, but we think, implementation, phasing in, and support from the legislature, the administration, and local governments in making sure that service delivery is not harmed as we, sort of seek to meet these multiple objectives. But make no mistake, the nonprofit sector in this state feels very strongly about supporting what Senator Leno is trying to do and what City of LA and others are also taking on.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
comments.
you.
We'll have Senator Stone go ahead and proceed with some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Senator Leno, Senator Leyva, sir, thank you for your testimony today. Professor, there certainly isn't a unanimous feeling about your prospects that increasing the minimum wage would not reduce the number of jobs in the state. And I'll quote just a few sources. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, our equivalent of the LAO, in a recent report found that the increase of the minimum wage hurts the economy by causing job losses. A study published in 2015 by Jonathan Meir from Texas A&M and Jeremy West from MIT found that increasing the minimum wage actually reduces the number of jobs available. And then another one, economists from the University of California, Irvine, and the Federal Reserve Board found that 85% of the most credible studies on minimum wage point to job loss for less skilled workers. And then I think we will all agree that Milton Friedman is a respected Nobel Prize winner who also said that increasing the rate of unemployment, especially among African American teenagers, is largely a result of minimum wage laws. And so my concern in representing a county that has a lot of services, we have a lot of restaurants, tourism, especially in the Palm Springs area, they've expressed significant concerns that, basically increasing the minimum wage by 30% is going to dramatically impact, number one, the cost of those services to people, and two, is going to require them to reevaluate their staffing levels and to potentially require employees to do more with less and having less employees. And I agree that I'm in support of a federal minimum wage of $10.10. And the reason why I'm supporting it is because I understand it's getting people closer to a livable wage, but it's something that is universally paid throughout the country. Now, the state of California is proposing to embark on a new threshold, if you will, of $13 per hour, which is going to further make us more business unfriendly. We rank at the bottom of the list, according to the chief executive's annual report of CEOs, that California is dead last. This certainly is not going to create an asset for businesses. And I appreciate the data that you've given about the increase in employment numbers. But one thing that those numbers don't reflect is that there have been thousands of people that have already left the state. There have businesses in the droves that have already left the state, have gone to Texas, South Carolina, Nevada, Arizona. They're gone. There are people that are stuck here in the state of California because they may not be able to afford to leave the state and are jumping at any opportunity to have a job. So I have many concerns. One of the concerns is IHSS. We had to come up with $66 million in the last budget because of overtime that were paid. We have a rapidly growing population. Has anybody come up with what the cost is going to be to the state of California now for basically increasing the minimum wage by roughly 30%? In a program that is going to have more of a demand, not less of a demand, where we're already having trouble paying the cost of those services. I also want to continue the discussion that my very esteemed colleague from Los Angeles brought up about the developmental community. we have a wonderful program in the Coachella Valley called Desert Arc, and it employs developmentally disadvantaged people. And I took a tour of this facility, and it's unbelievable what they do for many employers throughout the United States. And one of their chief concerns was, they said, Senator, please do what you can to stabilize the minimum wage. Don't increase the minimum wage, because we have programs that provide a subsidy so that these people can work. And we can't afford a delta of any larger amount of money that has to be subsidized, because we would be taking jobs away from these people that are being very productive and are working. And lastly, with respect to poverty, you know, $20,705 is basically the average salary of somebody that's getting a $10.10 minimum wage. And I think we'll all agree on this dais. I think the citizens of the state would agree that that is poverty level income. We're going to possibly $13 an hour, which brings us up to about $27,000. And I would argue that that's still a poverty wage. And I have been extremely excited about serving on committees here. And as many of you know, this is my first term in the legislature. And I want to do what I can to lift people out of poverty. I was actively involved in our CAP program in the county and doing what we could we had a goal of eliminating poverty in Riverside County. And now, as a state official, I want to eliminate poverty in the state of California. But I believe that just by artificially increasing the minimum wage is not the right mechanism to do it. The right mechanism to do it is to take money and invest in our college systems, making sure that we have college available for single moms and people that maybe didn't get the right breaks when they were growing up, and giving them the educational tools to lift themselves out of this horrific situation we find ourselves in. I believe that by increasing the minimum wage, and this is where we'll just agree to disagree, is that we're going to be hurting those that we most prolifically want to help. We want to help low-income people rise out of poverty, but we need to give them the tools to do that. And I'm very supportive of programs in our community college programs, helping people with child care, and letting the moms and the dads that are looking to better their lives for themselves and their children to achieve the American dream, to rise out of poverty. But I believe that this is going to, again, make California so much different than our competitors throughout the country, where we have paid sick leave impacts, we have higher taxes with Prop 30 that may or may not end in the very near future, the most expensive workman's comp, the high cost for everybody, of course, to implement Obamacare, and a very high unemployment insurance premium to make up for the insolvency of that program, and the highest taxes of any state in the union. If you combine all of this now, and now you add this higher minimum wage, I personally believe that we are pushing this state to a threshold of a catastrophe, where we have governors from other states now that have already grabbed the low-hanging fruit. Those are the large businesses that are leaving. Businesses like Toyota, businesses like Sherwin-Williams Paints. They're taking thousands of jobs with them, and now they're coming in and they're going after the small businessman and taking the small businesses out of state. And with FedEx and UPS, people can ship with Amazon.com. You don't have to have a bricks and mortar facility to have these jobs in the state anymore. And we cannot rely on the beautiful climate and our beautiful mountains and our beautiful oceans to keep people here. People have to eat. People want to have opportunities. And there is going to come a time, and I don't want to see it happen, that we are just going to basically price ourselves out of business in the state of California and become nothing more than a welfare state. I believe we can do better. So I'd like the professors to respond to all these other colleagues, and I would hope that you would consider them respectable colleagues, on why they differ so much differently than you.
Is that okay if I go first? I guess I'll just restrict myself to the other economists that you're citing, because I have comments on everything you've said, but I'll leave that for let other people have a chance also. The fact is that 25 years ago, most economists did think that the minimum wage hurt employment. They thought so not because of the kind of argument that John Boehner made, that when you raise the price of something, you want less of it, but because of the empirical research. The reason that we go to the empirical research is because the minimum wage could reduce the demand for labor, but it can also increase the supply of labor. And so, in Econ 1, we teach that demand and supply are both important. The kind of public mind, and many economists too, is just on the demand side. But George Stigler, who is a founder of the Chicago School and one of Milton Friedman's teachers, and a Nobel Prize winner, who wrote the first academic article on the economics of minimum wages in the late 1940s, made this point about the increased labor supply. And it's been in every labor economics undergraduate textbook ever since. So we have to be very careful about kind of the images that are in our head about this is just, well, if you increase the price, you're going to want less of it, especially those who are less vulnerable. And so what I did, following the lead of David Card and Alan Kruger, was to look at two counties that were next to each other that had different minimum wages because they were on opposite sides of a state border. Card and Kruger did this in the early 1990s for New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey raised its minimum wage, state minimum wage, Pennsylvania did not. Later on, the federal minimum wage went up, which meant Pennsylvania's minimum wage went up, but New Jersey's did not, and so on. And Card and Kruger were unable to find any difference in any employment effects. The previous studies by Newmark and Washer, Newmark is the UC Irvine professor that you mentioned, who, by the way, completely disagrees with you about the outflow of jobs to other states in his work on job mobility. But what they did was they compared states across the country and which ones were raising their minimum wages and when, and statistically they came up with negative effects of the minimum wage on employment. But what they did was they compared a state that raised its minimum wage to the average state. What Card and Kruger did was they compared nearby states that were very similar. What I did with my colleagues Dubé and Lester was to notice that the states that raise minimum wages are not typical of the states in the United States. They're different in other ways. In particular, we found that even 2 years before minimum wage increase, employment was falling in, say, restaurants or among teens in those states compared to the states that did not. So a good scientific experiment or analysis, you have a treatment group and a control group. And you want the control group to be very similar to the treatment group, just like in a medical study, beforehand, before the treatment is administered. And what we found is that the Newmark and Washer studies and Sabia and Mir and West that you mentioned also don't take this into account. They don't check to see whether their treatment and control groups are similar beforehand. There's the states that raise their minimum wage have had more inequality, they've had deeper economic recessions, things that are not the result of minimum wages themselves. And so they were, the Newmark and Washer, who cite this 85% figure that you mentioned, are basically picking up a spurious correlation that's not causal. And our work has pointed this out and has changed the views of many, many economists in the last, and you see this in the polls that have been done at the University of Chicago Booth Business School, which has asked its panel of expert economists, what do you think about a 10-10 minimum wage and so on, and they cite our work often as changing their views. Since then, Newmark and Washer have come back with criticisms, oh yeah, nearby counties aren't that similar and so on. And that's getting into the technical weeds. We've responded and so forth. It's never going to be unanimous. You're asking for unanimity. You're not going to get economists unanimous on anything. But certainly I think the center of opinion has shifted quite a bit. And I maintain that we're correct. Mir and West's assume that a one-time minimum wage increase will reduce employment growth forever. that just doesn't make any sense. And their numbers on negative effects are outlandish. They're way beyond Newmark's and Washer's. They say, well, you have to look at where the minimum wage has actually stayed high in order to get these long-term effects. To our north, we have Oregon and Washington, which have raised their minimum wages 20% above the federal level in the late 90s and have indexed it ever since. This is the exact laboratory for Mir and West. And when you look at what's happened since, if Mir and West are right, employment fell 6% in those states during the Great Recession because of the minimum wage. But the total employment fall in those years was 6%. It just doesn't pass a smell test to say that the minimum wage caused all the decline in employment and not the Great Recession. So a lot of us don't really, and it hasn't been published yet, by the way, that paper. So I don't regard it as a useful piece of work. The CBO, we already heard from Goldman Sachs people, they were relying on the studies that I did. I wrote a very detailed analysis of the CBO report that Politico magazine, not your leftist magazine, published last February, a year ago, after the report came out. And I pointed out that the CBO did not estimate any actual effects of employment, on employment. They went through the studies and did not do any studies themselves. And they kind of said, well, Newark and Washer find one thing, Reich finds another, let's take the average between the two. You can't do that. That's not good science. And I think that's why Goldman and Sachs, and also the Council of Economic Advisors, when they responded to this in the White House, came down on the side that the CBO estimate was more politically determined than scientifically determined.
Great. Any more questions?
Yeah, just one follow-up. There was another study by American University that studied 28 states that increased their minimum wage between 2003 and 2007. And their conclusion was that they saw no decrease in poverty in those states. Are you familiar with that study?
My colleague Aaron Dubé has done by far the best study on the effect of the minimum wage on poverty. And, you know, the minimum wage is not meant to be a poverty-reducing policy. It's meant to raise living standards for workers. And there are a lot of people who are not employed, who are poor, and a minimum wage is not going to affect those people. Nonetheless, as someone pointed out already, many of our people in poverty and who receive public benefits are employed. And so my colleague Aaron Dubé looked at this fact, and he both reviewed all the previous studies, and he found that most of them found that the minimum wage did reduce poverty, and he found that himself using, I think, the most up-to-date statistical methods, you know, and so on. So
Senator, if I could, I'm not sure which 28 states, but I could almost be certain that none of them ended paying poverty wages. So when you continue to pay poverty wages, you're not going to impact poverty much. What makes this bill different is when it's fully implemented and we get to $13 an hour by 2017, we will get just above the federal poverty line. And I agree with you, it's still a measly salary, but it will get people above the federal poverty line, and that's how we determine who's in poverty. This bill will raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Californians, by definition, out of poverty and take them off the public assistance rolls.
Thank you.
Any more questions from our senators? We're going to, you have any more speakers? I know we
Been
have.
very gracious.
Yeah, I know we've, let me just say a few words, because we're going to go to the Me Too's in a second, so.
Sure.
Please.
Our sponsor.
Yeah, sponsor.
A word from our sponsor.
Word from our sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike Carroll with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. We are proud to be the sponsor of SB 3. We view this as the most important anti-poverty measure in the legislature this year. And for the reasons that were just stated, SB 3, when fully implemented in 2017, will actually move families of 3 and families of 4 above the federal poverty level. And keep them there, because we'll then index the minimum wage to inflation going forward. For that reason, it addresses a key concern that this body has been looking at in recent years, which is that we now know there are some 8 million people in California who live in poverty in this state right now. About 2 million of them are children. Another piece of research that we've learned in recent years is that poverty has measurable long-term impacts on the development, the growth and development of young children. There was a recent study, and there have been many studies on this subject in recent years. Stanford University's study on the long reach of early childhood poverty says that poverty can disrupt the development of brain architecture, and children raised in poverty are more likely to experience toxic stress than non-poor children. Excessively stressful conditions early in childhood have been linked to a number of changes in the brain that compromise healthy development. That is why interventions that address early sources of toxic stress are likely to lead to more positive life trajectories. And among those outcomes that are negative that the researchers have found is that those children, when they grow up, are less likely to finish high school. They're more likely to be poor, less likely to be working as a young adult, and the longer that these children are subjected to this toxic stress, the worse those outcomes are for them as an adult. There is some good news, though, in their study, which is that relatively modest increases in incomes of $3,000 or more in those children's lives when they're young, from 0 to 6, can reverse most of those negative impacts that I just discussed. And that's exactly what SB3 does. It will help raise incomes above the poverty level by when we go the jump from $12 to $13 an hour, from $11 to $13 an hour, we will increase those incomes by around $4,000 a year for those young children. This will have a long-term, significant, positive effect for the state of California. We'll see our kids do better coming out of school. More of them will get high school diplomas. More of them will be working as adults. They'll have higher incomes as adults. So we really view this as a very wise investment to be coupled with the kind of investments that Senator Stone is correctly pointing out, that we also have to provide these children that will help lift them further out of poverty. This will just give people the chance to have that opportunity in life to move up and out of poverty, and to make sure that they're not relying on public assistance as they go forward. And for all these reasons, and those stated by the previous witnesses, we strongly support the bill and urge its passage today. Thank you.